I'm gonna take you through the mixing and mastering process of my new song, Endlessly. Oh yeah. Welcome back, nerds. So Endlessly came out on May 29th, and I've been super excited about the different feedback I've gotten. It's ranged from the music video to the different tones I used and the mix and master. Thanks to everyone who's checked it out so far, and there is a link below in the description if you'd like to. The entire process of recording, mixing, and mastering was all self-done, so I wanted to take the opportunity to show you exactly how you could do the same thing, or maybe learn a couple of tips on the way. So without further ado, let me show you how to do the thing. So I usually start with making sure all my processing is correct, and then I start with the drums, so it'll go from kick to snare to toms, cymbals, rooms, etc. It'll take you chronologically through all those steps, but there's a couple things I just want to show you before we get started with that. So typically, I won't actually have any processing going on until I get to the instrument bus stage. So that means until I have the drums, the guitars, the bass all set up. I want to get the rock elements all in a place where I like it before I start involving things like mix bus processing, anything like that. So right now, for the sake of recording, I've got Restream set up, I've got the mic soloed out, I've got a drum bus soloed, and it's ready to start with the kick. I'll just show you what I've got all my drums set up through MIDI, because I've got a couple of different VSTs going on. I've got my MIDI set up through Kontakt, and in Kontakt, I've got two separate chains. So the first one is just going to be cymbals through GGD P4 kit, and all my shells are going through Hanson Audio, the Molten kit. The kick that I'm using in this case is Varus Morpheus 22, and I'm using a one-shot with it. So this is what the kick sounds like just straight up by itself. All I've got on that is a Pro Q with some really minor stuff just to get rid of some mud, and then an auto align. On auto align, it's sending a channel to the other samples, and basically the idea behind this is it'll help get your other samples in phase with it as you layer more samples on top of it. Now I'll add in the first sample, and this is going to be the one shot. By itself. Just a clicky sounding one shot, which kind of gives it a little bit of unrealistic sound to it. Gets it a little bit more punch and cuts through the mix. Then I'm also adding this sample here. Good old sumo sub. As you can see on the one shot, I didn't feel I needed auto align. That's probably because they're both coming through the same loader, but with this sample I decided to move it a little bit with a delay, which kind of makes the phase sound a little bit better. In this case it's really not that extreme, but I'll show you guys what it sounds like before and after. Really can't hear that myself right now, but I'm sure that it was intentional when I did it. So that's all the kick layers I'm using. I'll take you through the bus now. So on the bus, I've got first DF clip, which kind of makes things sound a little crazy. I guess I opted not to make it way too crazy, but it kind of makes it a little bit more clear and hi-fi sounding to me. And then I've got it running through soft tube vet compressor, which is the difference with it on and off. Again, making it a little bit more hi-fi and kind of making it pump a little bit. It's actually doing a little bit less than I might typically do, but if I remember when I was mixing this, I think I wanted to give this record a little bit more of a natural sound. And later on, that resulted in less producer decisions, like adding less risers and less actual sub drops and things like that. And then I've got the Smash and Grab by Get Good Drums. This is adding saturation, and I think it's also balancing the output. Then I've got a Pro Q here, which seems to be taking out a metric fuck ton of low end. I usually make decisions like this over time as I'm going through different mix revisions, just to see if I can change the low end. Usually that's the thing that ends up changing the most as I go through different mix revisions. So I probably wanted to have more low end from the bass than the kick, and I probably wanted to keep the upper frequencies from the attack of the kick, so I didn't want to bring the actual full volume down. So I just turned down the low end. And then I've got a Pro MB here, which is reducing the sub as the kick hits. So it's going to pull down the sub after every hit. Off. kind of cleans up the mix, but I will say it's starting to sound a little bit thin, so I have to imagine that later in the mix I did something to compensate for this. So that's the kick. Now we'll look at what's going on with the snare. So the snare I chose for this is the Ludwig Festival 14x5. I chose it because it has a really nice mid-range on it, so I'll disable the bus and I'll just hear what that sounds like by itself. Yeah, that pretty much sounds exactly how I'd want a snare to sound. And here I've got the usual EQ. And I have to mention, the samples are really good quality, and I can tell they already come with EQ and different things done to them. So due to the processing they've already had, you might do less than you would with an unprocessed snare, or if you have a real snare instead of a sample. Here I'll find a place where it's playing the snare and some ghost notes for it. My approach with MIDI for the snare is to try to balance the velocities with it. So if I'm doing a harder hit and it's in the full mix, it's usually going to be something like 117 velocity. And if it's in a softer part, I might go between 90 and 100. And here for ghost notes or just lighter hits in general, I'll be doing something like 49 to 60 or so. So this is what the snare sounds like just by itself. So here I'll add the one shot in. You can really hear the one shot on the harder hits. The EQ isn't too crazy, but I did find a resonance here. In the mix, I just felt like it wasn't adding anything good. And then I also added another sample here, snare attack, and what is this doing? So the way that I set this up is that it's really just adding an attack on the front end. It does not have any sustain or anything like that. That means it's really good to add into a snare to give it a nice impact punch without adding too much weird phase issues as the mid-range sustains out. So let's hear this with and without. Yeah, that's making a huge difference there. And I also set up the trigger so that it would not be triggered when it's doing the ghost notes. That way they sound more natural without the one shots interfering too much. So on this sample, I've got no EQ going on, along with auto align, which is adjusting about 15 samples. All right, and the last snare sample is snare room here. I'm also adding a little bit of saturation so I can make it sound thicker. Here's it without. And then with. Really sounds explosive and kind of increases the stereo width of the snare. That's really good when you have a really thick mix and you want it to sustain more. So when you have all these mono elements that are going heavy and you've got the vocals coming in, when you've got a snare room that kind of sustains after the hit, you really hear the impact of it on the mix. So that's all the snare samples going to the snare bus here. I've got DF clip again. Definitely doing a little bit of brightening in this. That's something I find as I go through different mix revisions. I usually make my snare brighter and my kick brighter. Then I've got it going through another soft tube FET compressor here with it on. Yeah, it's really controlling that initial transient and increasing the stain a little bit so you can make it louder in a mix. And then I've got the same situation with GGD saturating it a bit. And then I've got an EQ on this resonance here. Yeah, I can see why that ring would really pop out in a mix. Alright, so now let's just hear how the snare and the kick sound together. Sounding huge and explosive and a bit fake, so I'll probably fix that later on. So moving on to toms, I'll just find a fill, starting with the original tom. I probably thought that sounded a little bit soft for how I wanted this song to be, so I used Trigger and it's on Helm's Deep, which I think is from Bogren Drums. So let's hear how that sounds. Yeah, immediately much more hi-fi, and I've got a Pro Q doing some crazy stuff. Looks like I'm trying to get more attack and kind of scoop out some of the body in that. And I imagine, yep, I'm doing the same thing on them, and I've got it going throughout the different samples in the Helm's Deep. So here's all them together. And then in the actual bus for it, it looks like I'm doing the exact same shenanigans. Just adding brightness and making the attack a little bit more. And it looks like on this one I am actually doing a little bit of compression on it. And a Pro MB just for the low end. I notice sometimes when you do a fill with tom, it can have low end that stays around and kind of clouds the rest of the mix. So that's what I'm trying to fix here. So I'll let that play out and I'll show you how it just drags the low end down after it plays. If you could read that, basically within like half a second, it's bringing it down 20 decibels. And that's extreme, but I just want it to be out of the way quickly if I'm doing something else. And then one thing I've got is a limiter going on in that. So that's probably just going to make sure that they're all staying front and center when they come in. It's also adding a measurable loudness to that. All right, let's hear tom, snare, and kick together to make sure it's all still cohesive. Sounding bright, attacky, and a little bit fake, but I'm sure I will figure that out. All right, moving on to the overheads. I'm pretty sure the way I routed this in Kontakt is to have all the cymbals pretty much sending to the overheads. So that way I have only one track that's pre-balanced, so I don't have to mess with it all. So on that track, I've got a pretty crazy looking EQ here. So I'm increasing the brightness pretty significantly. I imagine that's one of those things that I do a little bit more extreme as the mix revisions come in. And then taking out some resonances here. That's pretty typical with cymbals. I'm also adding a big low cut here and reducing the dynamics of what I assume is especially the snare. Yeah, I really didn't want the knocky stuff to come through on the overheads, especially because that's what triggers it. So if I add any compressor after the fact, sometimes it'll latch on to only the snare and then the cymbals will get darker every time it pushes the snare back. You can solve those different ways, but this is how I do it. And then I've got another EQ here, and this is actually one of the Fab Filter presets. I think I just like the compression and the way that it controls some of it a little bit more. But if you look at what it's doing, it's essentially the same thing at a more extreme level. And then I've got Soothe, which is an absolute must-have for me. I'll show you the delta of what it's doing. So what's so cool about Soothe is, for me, when I apply it to something, it'll basically make it a smoother sound of that. It can get pretty extreme, but sometimes you actually want that. So what I'll do with the cymbals is I'll put Soothe on and I'll move it up and down until it feels like some of those resonances aren't so harsh on my ears. So here you're not even really hearing the attack anymore, so I'm going to move it back down until it sounds more normal. Yeah, something like that can really go a long way. And then I've got Smash and Grab, just doing some compression here. Alright, moving on to the room. So how I try to mix the room in is, you basically got direct mics for everything, right? You've got snare, kick, toms, you've got the overheads. The only thing it's missing is glue to tie it all together and kind of give it one cohesive picture. So the way I'll mix the room in is I'll actually have all the drums playing, and I'll just bring it up until it almost sounds too noisy, and then I'll bring it back down. So I'll show you the room chain, and then I'll show you how I mixed it. So it's got an EQ pretty similar to the overheads. And then I've got Soundtoys Effect Rack with the Devil-Lock. This is kind of a crazy plugin, but basically what it's going to do is like super crazy compression. It has a dark knob that really lets you dial it in to get as noisy as you want without being harsh and annoying. And then it's got the crunch knob, which is adding distortion, which makes it really nice and thick. So when you add the room in and it kind of acts like glue for all the different direct mics, it starts to sound really thick and kind of interacts with itself. So this is the difference with it off. And then with it on. So now I'll just mix the room in with all the different direct mics. The loudest element that I'm hearing as I push it forward is the low kick rumble, so I'll try to move it back so it's not so annoying to me. I would pretty much run it through some bus compression. So first thing is going to be parallel compression. This is pretty simple, but basically what I've got going on is a Saturn, which is adding parallel saturation, which is just going to make it thick and crunchy, and then Pro C, which is going to be acting crazy, and then EQ just to make sure the low end doesn't get too crazy. So this is what Saturn's doing. And then Pro C. Basically trying to make it sound absolutely crazy, and then as you mix it in the drum bus, it gets kind of pumpy and crazy, but it doesn't sound way too unrealistic in a way that you couldn't get without parallel compression. And I've also got a reverb bus here. So the reverb bus is just going to be the snare and the toms. It's kind of like adding an additional room sound to it, but I felt like sometimes it's good to add a little bit of thickness and ambience into the mix as you're actually doing the song. So this gives me just one easy slider as I'm mixing to increase the ambience coming from the snare and the toms. Yeah, it really makes it sound wider there. And then last on the drum bus, what I've got is K-Clip. So this is kind of doing stuff that's going to reward me when I'm mastering rather than now. But basically what a clipper is going to do is it's going to chop off the peaks. So if you have a compressor, it's compressing the loudest sound. So what a clipper is going to do is it chops off the peaks of the loudest sound so it fits in more with everything else. That way when you have something feeding into a compressor, it's not going to be so crazy. I've more recently been doing this across the drum bus because when I start mastering with a limiter, it gets the whole mix louder and punchier without having to sacrifice the transients that I get in my actual drums. So this is before the clipper. So if you couldn't hear the difference there, it's actually pretty subtle. The way this clipper is reacting is it's only reacting on those really, really quick transients that go above the threshold. It's really quick. It's just for the peaks. It seems like it's doing a lot, and it kind of is, but not in a super audible way. It'll make a lot more sense once we get to the actual limiting. So that is the drums. Moving on to the bass.